Across forests, tundras, and shadowed ridges, nights unravel into chaos as belongings shift unnaturally. Guttural growls echo, and footprints far too large to dismiss vanish without a trace. From a family tragedy in Finland to a camper's eerie rescue in Oregon, each account deepens the mystery. In this video, we'll uncover 6 terrifying encounters that remain unforgettable. In late September 2025, Juhani Korhonen, a 43-year-old engineer from Helsinki, decided his family needed a proper escape from city life. He booked a weekend stay at a remote yurt in the small village of Posio in northern Finland, a sparsely populated region of vast boreal forests, frozen lake, and dense pine groves that stretched endlessly beneath the Arctic Circle. The yurt was situated approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest access road, deep in the wilderness that had long attracted outdoor enthusiasts seeking solitude. His wife, Lisa, had been hesitant about bringing their 2 children, 11-year-old Aino and 8-year-old Oskari, to such an isolated location as winter approached, especially given the local folklore. The indigenous Sami people had long whispered stories about creatures that walked upright through these forests when humans should have been the only ones there. Tales of strange occurrences, disappearances, and odd formations in the snow. Most dismissed these as tall tales meant to discourage reckless adventurers from venturing too deep into the unforgiving landscape. But Juhani insisted the experience would be memorable. The family arrived on the afternoon of September 30th, hauling their supplies through knee-deep snow along a narrow trail. The yurt, a traditional round tent reinforced with modern weatherproofing, stood in a clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees, heavy with early autumn snow. The yurt's owner had left firewood stacked neatly outside, along with basic provisions and emergency supplies. As evening settled over the forest, the temperature plummeted to well below freezing. Juhani built a fire in the central stove while Lisa prepared a simple dinner. The children, initially excited by the adventure, grew quieter as darkness enveloped the clearing and strange sounds began filtering through the trees, branches cracking under weight that should not have been there, and occasional thuds against the frozen ground. Around 11 o'clock that night, the first stone struck the yurt's outer wall with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. Lisa had been settling the children into their sleeping bags when the impact occurred. Juhani rushed outside with a flashlight, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except shadows and falling snow. He returned inside, assuring his family it had probably been a branch falling from above. 20 minutes later, another stone hit, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once. The sound was unlike anything Juhani had heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something that triggered an ancient, primal fear. The family huddled together as the harassment continued. Stones pelted the yurt at irregular intervals, each impact accompanied by those terrible growls. Juhani attempted to use his satellite phone to contact emergency services, but the connection failed repeatedly. He told Lisa they would wait until dawn and then make their way back to the vehicle, regardless of the conditions. The children, terrified and crying, pressed against their mother while the fire in the stove began to die down. Juhani ventured outside once more around midnight to retrieve more firewood from the stack. That was when the attack began in earnest. Lisa heard her husband shout, not words, but a sound of pure terror, followed by heavy impacts and splintering wood. She grabbed the children and pushed them toward the yurt's entrance, but something massive struck the structure from the outside. The reinforced canvas walls, designed to withstand harsh weather, tore like paper under what appeared to be enormous claws. Lisa managed to get Aino and Oskari outside, but the clearing offered no safety. A towering shadow moved between the trees, impossibly large and unmistakably bipedal. The family scattered in panic. Lisa tried to shield her children, but the creature moved with terrifying speed despite its size. The forest erupted with the sounds of pursuit, heavy footfalls in the snow, branches snapping, and those horrific growls. Juhani, bleeding from multiple lacerations across his back and arms, attempted to draw the creature away from his family. He stumbled through the deep snow, shouting and waving his flashlight, but the beam seemed to attract rather than repel whatever hunted them. When the ranger team arrived at dawn on October 1st, responding to the automated emergency beacon that had finally activated, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. The yurt stood partially collapsed, its walls shredded by what appeared to be massive claws. The neat stack of firewood had been scattered across the clearing, with several logs arranged in a deliberate pattern that none of the rangers could explain. Emergency supplies had been torn from their storage containers and placed in odd configurations around the site. Lisa Korhonen and her 2 children were discovered approximately 30 meters from the yurt, their bodies partially covered by wind-blown snow. The medical examiner would later cite hypothermia as the primary cause of death, but the rangers noted extensive bruising consistent with physical trauma. Juhani was found barely conscious, half buried in a drift of snow and mud near the tree line. He had suffered severe lacerations, 3 broken ribs, and was suffering from advanced hypothermia. As the rangers worked to stabilize him, he muttered incoherently about a shadow, something massive that had struck them, pursued them, and seemed to study them before disappearing into the forest. The most disturbing evidence lay in the snow itself. Enormous footprint, clearly human-shaped but measuring over 60 centimeters in length, led from the demolished yurt into the forest. The prints showed 5 distinct toes and demonstrated a stride length impossible for any known animal. The rangers followed the trail for nearly a kilometer before it simply vanished at the edge of a frozen stream, as if whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist. Official reports attributed the tragedy to a combination of severe weather, possible wildlife encounter, and panic-induced poor decision-making. Yet the rangers who processed the scene found themselves unable to accept that explanation. The deliberate arrangement of supplies, the methodical destruction of the yurt, and those impossible footprints suggested something else entirely: an intelligence, a massive presence that had observed, attacked, and disappeared without leaving any conventional trace. Juhani Korhonen survived his physical injuries, but remained hospitalized for weeks, unable or unwilling to provide a coherent account of what had killed his family in that remote Finnish forest. The abandoned copper mine near the town of Revelstoke in British Columbia had been closed since the early 1990s, its tunnels sealed and forgotten as the mining company moved operations elsewhere. The region, nestled in the Selkirk Mountains, had a reputation among locals for strange occurrences. Hikers reported feeling watched, equipment malfunctioned without explanation, and occasionally, massive footprints appeared in the snow near old mining sites. The provincial government had commissioned a small crew to assess the structural integrity of several shafts before deciding whether to permanently close them, seal them, or convert portions into historical sites. In early March 2025, 4 contract workers, Gareth Pemberton, Liam Ashford, Sophie Blackwell, and Elena Morozova, descended into one of the deeper shafts, armed with surveying equipment, headlamp, and emergency supplies. Gareth, a veteran structural engineer in his 50s, led the team with the confidence of someone who had explored dozens of similar sites. Liam and Sophie, both in their 30s, handled the technical measurement, while Elena, the youngest at 26, documented their findings. The shaft descended nearly 200 meters, its walls still showing the scars of decades-old drilling and the rusted remnants of support structures. The crew had been working for approximately 3 hours when the first tremor shook the tunnel. Gareth initially assumed it was minor seismic activity, common enough in the mountainous region, but the vibrations felt wrong, rhythmic, almost deliberate. The support beams began creaking ominously, and loose debris trickled from the ceiling. Sophie suggested they evacuate immediately, but before they could organize their equipment, a sound echoed through the darkness, a low, guttural growl that seemed to originate from the deeper tunnels they had not yet explored. The headlamp, which had been functioning perfectly, began flickering in unison. Liam, who had been examining a junction point about 20 meters ahead, shouted back that he had seen something. He described a massive figure, upright and impossibly tall, standing just beyond the reach of his lamp before it vanished around a bend. The others dismissed it as shadows playing tricks, but Elena noticed something disturbing. The air had changed. A pungent, acrid smell now permeated the shaft, something organic and foreign that had not been present moments before. Another growl reverberated through the tunnels, closer this time and unmistakably hostile. A wooden support beam suddenly splintered with a crack like a gunshot, the massive timber splitting as if struck by tremendous force. Fragments rained down, narrowly missing Gareth's head. The crew abandoned their equipment and began a panicked retreat toward the surface. As they ran, their headlamps illuminated something that froze Elena in her tracks. Deep gouges carved into the rock wall, fresh scratches that had not been there during their descent. The marks were too high for any person to have made without a ladder, and too deliberate to be natural erosion. The ascent became a nightmare of stumbling through darkness, equipment left scattered behind them, and the constant sensation of being pursued by something just beyond the reach of their failing lights. Sophie swore she felt something brush against her backpack, a force strong enough to nearly knock her off balance. The growls continued, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, as if whatever shared the tunnels was herding them rather than simply chasing. By the time the crew emerged into daylight, they were incoherent with terror. A ranger team, having been alerted by the crew's missed check-in time, found them collapsed near the mine entrance, covered in mud and rock dust, unable to articulate what had happened below. Medical examination revealed no serious physical injuries, though all four displayed symptoms of extreme psychological trauma and hypothermia, despite the relatively mild spring weather. The Rangers ventured into the shaft to retrieve the abandoned equipment. What they discovered defied easy explanation. The surveying tools had been moved from where the crew insisted they had dropped them, now stacked in a neat but unnatural pile near the junction point. The walls bore fresh, claw-like scratches, deep gouges that would have required immense strength to carve into solid rock. Most disturbing were the footprints pressed into the muddy sections of the tunnel floor. Enormous, human-shaped impressions measuring over 60 centimeters in length, showing 5 distinct toes and a stride pattern suggesting bipedal movement. The prints led deeper into the unexplored sections of the mine before disappearing at a collapsed section that had been undisturbed for decades. The Rangers reported their findings to the provincial authorities, who promptly ordered the shaft permanently sealed. Official statements attributed the incident to structural instability and panic-induced mass hysteria, perhaps triggered by toxic gas pockets releasing from deeper in the mine. Yet the 4 workers refused to accept that explanation. Gareth Pemberton, despite his decades of mining experience, declined all future underground contracts. Elena Morozova left the surveying profession entirely. All 4 maintained that something massive and intelligent had been in those tunnels with them, something that had tested them, observed them, and deliberately driven them to the surface. The scratches, the rearranged equipment, and those impossible footprints suggested a presence far more calculating than any known wildlife. Something that understood the layout of human-made structures and knew how to use the darkness to its advantage before vanishing without leaving conventional traces. The wilderness surrounding the small town of Ovando in western Montana had remained largely unchanged for centuries, its dense forests and mountain valleys serving as critical habitat for elk, deer, and black bears. The region attracted hunters each autumn, drawn by the promise of trophy animals and the solitude offered by thousands of acres of backcountry. Local outfitters warned clients about bear safety and the dangers of getting lost, but rarely mentioned the stranger reports that occasionally surfaced. Massive footprints found far from established trails, entire elk carcasses moved distances that seemed impossible, and the unsettling feeling of being observed from the shadows. Thomas Grady, a 47-year-old insurance adjuster from Billings, had been hunting these forests for nearly 2 decades. He considered himself an experienced outdoorsman, capable of tracking game across difficult terrain and comfortable spending days alone in the wilderness. In early November 2024, he had obtained permits for the hunting season and set up a small camp approximately 15 kilometers from the nearest forest access road. His target was a mature bull elk, and early reconnaissance had revealed promising signs of a sizable herd moving through the area. On the morning of November 8th, Thomas set out before dawn, following fresh tracks through a light dusting of snow. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and fog hung thick between the trees, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. He moved carefully, aware that elk possessed keen senses and would bolt at the slightest disturbance. After nearly 2 hours of tracking, he heard the distinctive bugling call of a bull elk somewhere ahead, answered by the sounds of other herd members moving through the underbrush. Thomas crept forward, positioning himself downwind and using the fog as cover. What happened next would replay in his mind for months afterward. Through a gap in the trees, he spotted movement, but not elk. A massive figure stood upright in a small clearing, its arms wrapped around the body of a freshly killed cow elk. The creature, standing at least 2.5 meters tall, was covered in dark, matted hair and possessed a build that suggested immense strength. Thomas froze, his rifle suddenly feeling inadequate and irrelevant. The figure dragged the elk carcass across the forest floor with an ease that defied explanation. A mature cow elk weighed approximately 300 kilograms, yet this creature moved it as if it were nothing more than a deer. Thomas watched, barely breathing, as the figure disappeared into the fog. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but the image burned itself into his memory. Those massive arms, the casual power, and the deliberate, intelligent way it moved through terrain that would have challenged any human. Thomas remained motionless for several minutes after the creature vanished, his heart hammering in his chest. Training and instinct warred within him. Every fiber of his being urged him to leave immediately, to abandon his camp and return to civilization. But another part, the part that had spent years tracking animals and understanding the wilderness, needed to verify what he had seen. He waited until his hands stopped shaking before cautiously approaching the area where the encounter had occurred. The forest floor told a story that official explanations would later struggle to dismiss. Enormous footprints, clearly human-shaped but measuring over 60 centimeters in length, were pressed deep into the mud and partially melted snow. The prints showed 5 distinct toes and demonstrated a stride length far exceeding what any person could achieve. Thomas followed the trail for approximately 30 meters, noting how the prints remained consistent in depth and spacing, despite the creature carrying such massive weight. Blood streaked across fallen logs and splattered on tree trunks at heights that seemed impossible. The elk had clearly been killed nearby. Thomas found the death site marked by disturbed earth and more blood, along with evidence suggesting the animal's neck had been broken with brutal efficiency. Broken branches and trampled undergrowth created a clear path leading deeper into the forest. The trail marked by those impossible footprints and occasional tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on low-hanging branches. Thomas committed every detail to memory, knowing that fog was growing thicker and would soon obscure the evidence. His phone had died during the cold night, rendering it useless. He followed the trail until it led into a section of forest so dense that progress became nearly impossible. There, at the base of a steep ravine, the footprints simply vanished. No signs of the creature entering the ravine, no continuation on the other side, just an abrupt end to a trail that had been unmistakable moments before. He returned to his camp, packed his equipment, and hiked out that same day. The following morning, Thomas contacted the local ranger station and filed a report, providing detailed descriptions and GPS coordinates. 2 rangers agreed to investigate, and Thomas accompanied them back to the site. The blood trails remained, as did the broken vegetation and some of the footprints, though rain during the night had obscured many of the clearest impressions. The rangers examined the evidence with professional skepticism. The senior ranger, a man named Patterson who had worked these forests for 30 years, suggested a bear had killed the elk and dragged it away. Thomas pointed out that the footprints were clearly not bear tracks, and that no bear possessed the strength to move a full-grown elk with such apparent ease. Patterson acknowledged the footprints were unusual, but maintained that wildlife behavior could often surprise even experienced observers. Official reports filed by the ranger station attributed the incident to predation by a large black bear, noting that bears occasionally walked on hind legs and could leave prints that appeared misleadingly human-like in certain soil conditions. The elk carcass was never recovered, presumably consumed or cached by whatever had taken it. Thomas returned to Billings but found himself unable to resume his normal hunting activities. He sold most of his equipment within weeks and declined invitations from friends to return to the Montana backcountry. The encounter left him with an unshakable certainty that something massive and intelligent inhabited those forests, something that understood how to hunt, how to use terrain to its advantage, and how to disappear without leaving traces that conventional tracking could follow. The precise trail, the calculated movement, and the sheer physical power required to handle that elk suggested a predator that existed outside the boundaries of recognized wildlife, something that observed human activity and chose when to reveal itself and when to vanish into the wilderness from which it came. The remote lake district in southeastern Alaska had long served as a monitoring station for wildlife management, its pristine waters and surrounding forests providing habitat for salmon, bears, and numerous bird species. The area, accessible only by float plane or a grueling 2-day hike, saw few visitors outside of the occasional research team or adventurous fishermen. Local indigenous communities spoke cautiously about the region, mentioning in vague terms that certain places deserved respect and distance, though they rarely elaborated on why. The Forest Service maintained a small patrol schedule, sending rangers through the area several times each summer to check for illegal camping and monitor trail conditions. In late August 2006, Rangers Ethan Moore and Lucas Hayes were assigned a routine 3-day patrol of the lake's northern shore. Ethan, 34 years old and a ranger for nearly a decade, had grown up in Alaska and considered himself well-versed in wilderness survival. Lucas, younger at 28, had transferred from a posting in Idaho 2 years earlier and still found Alaska's vast wilderness both exhilarating and intimidating. The 2 men had worked together multiple times and maintained a professional friendship built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They departed the ranger station on the morning of August 23rd, hiking the established trail that wound through dense spruce forest before opening onto the lake's rocky shoreline. The weather forecast predicted clear conditions, and both men carried standard patrol gear, emergency supplies, communication equipment, and bear deterrents. They planned to make camp at a designated site on the second night, before completing their circuit and returning to the station. On the afternoon of August 24th, Ethan radioed the station with a report that immediately concerned the dispatcher. His voice, normally calm and measured, carried an edge of tension. He described strange sounds echoing across the lake, guttural noises that did not match any wildlife he recognized. The calls seemed to come from multiple directions, sometimes from the forest behind their position, sometimes from across the water. Lucas had gone to investigate the tree line while Ethan maintained their position on the shore. The transmission continued for several minutes, with Ethan describing fleeting shadows moving among the trees at the forest edge. He mentioned that the fog had rolled in unexpectedly thick, reducing visibility to less than 20 meters. Lucas had returned, reporting that he found nothing but was unsettled by the oppressive silence in the forest. No birds, no small mammals, nothing but that strange smell he could not quite identify. Ethan signed off, saying they would attempt to move to higher ground and camp there instead of at the designated site. That was the last coherent communication received from either ranger. At approximately 7 that evening, the radio crackled with what sounded like shouting and heavy splashing, followed by static. Repeated attempts to raise Ethan or Lucas failed. A rescue team was assembled, but weather conditions prevented immediate deployment. By the time a helicopter could reach the area on August 26th, the fog had cleared. The scene discovered at the lake shocked even experienced search and rescue personnel. Ethan Moore and Lucas Hayes were found floating near the shore, their bodies partially submerged in the cold water. Both had drowned, according to the subsequent medical examination, though neither showed signs of struggle in the water itself. Their boots and backpacks were scattered along the rocky beach, positioned at intervals that seemed oddly deliberate rather than randomly dropped. Most disturbing was the placement of clothing items, pieces of their uniforms, a jacket, a torn shirt, a ranger hat, had been draped across tree branches 3 to 4 meters above the ground. The items were not tangled or caught naturally, but placed almost carefully, as if displayed. The rescue team found no evidence of ropes or climbing equipment that would explain how the clothing reached such heights. The shoreline revealed additional mysteries. Deep, human-shaped footprints measuring over 60 centimeters in length traced a path from the forest edge to the water, then back into the dense underbrush where they vanished completely. The prints were pressed firmly into the muddy sections of the beach, showing 5 distinct toes and a stride pattern suggesting bipedal movement. Near the water's edge, drag marks indicated that something large had entered the lake, though what it dragged remained unclear. Both rangers displayed extensive bruising on their arms and shoulders, injuries consistent with being grabbed or restrained by considerable force. The bruising patterns suggested hand-like grips, but far larger than any human hand could produce. Their radio equipment had been smashed, and several items from their packs, food supplies, a first aid kit, a flashlight, had been removed and scattered in a rough circle around their abandoned campsite. The official investigation concluded that Ethan and Lucas had experienced some form of wildlife encounter, possibly with a brown bear, that caused them to panic and flee into the lake, where they subsequently drowned. However, the investigators struggled to explain the clothing in the trees, the systematic destruction of equipment, or those enormous footprints. Bear tracks were notably absent from the immediate area, and the drag marks did not match any known bear behavior. The dispatcher who received Ethan's final transmissions provided testimony that complicated the official narrative. She described his growing alarm, his specific mention of shadows that moved with purpose, and his final words before the radio cut out. Something about Lucas seeing a massive figure standing upright at the tree line. These details were noted in the report, but ultimately attributed to stress and poor visibility conditions. The Lake District was temporarily closed to public access following the tragedy. When it reopened months later, some seasonal rangers reported ongoing unease when patrolling the northern shore. Equipment occasionally malfunctioned without explanation. Strange sounds continued to be reported, though never with the intensity that Ethan had described. And occasionally, after heavy rains, those enormous footprints would appear in the mud near the water's edge before vanishing back into the forest. Ethan Moore and Lucas Hayes were remembered as dedicated rangers who died in service. Their families received full honors, and a small memorial was placed at the ranger station. But among those who had processed the scene, who had seen the evidence that defied easy explanation, a different story persisted, one of an intelligent presence that had observed the two men, interacted with their belongings in ways that suggested deliberate intent, and ultimately driven them into the water through means that remained disturbingly unclear. The lake kept its secrets, and the forest surrounding it continued to harbor something that existed just beyond the reach of official acknowledgement. The Yukon Territory's northern reaches represented some of the most isolated wilderness in North America, where tundra stretched endlessly beneath vast skies, and human presence remained minimal even during summer months. The region experienced extreme temperature variations, with winter temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero, and fierce winds creating whiteout conditions that could disorient even experienced travelers. Indigenous peoples had traversed these lands for millennia, developing deep knowledge of survival techniques and maintaining cautious respect for the landscape's hidden dangers. Stories passed through generations spoke of things that walked the tundra when humans should have been alone, of massive figures glimpsed through blowing snow, and of travelers who vanished without explanation. Marcus Keene, a 39-year-old survivalist and wilderness explorer from Edmonton, had built a reputation for undertaking solo expeditions into extreme environments. He documented his travels meticulously in a weathered leather journal, recording observations about terrain, wildlife, and survival techniques. In February 2013, Marcus planned a 3-week solo trek across a remote section of tundra, carrying minimal supplies and relying on his skills to supplement provisions through ice fishing and small game hunting. He filed a detailed itinerary with authorities, marking checkpoint coordinates where he would activate an emergency beacon to confirm his progress. Marcus departed on February 9th during a brief window of relatively clear weather. He traveled light, pulling a specialized sled containing his tent, sleeping gear, food supplies, and scientific instruments for recording temperature and wind data. His journal entries from the first week, later recovered, described challenging but manageable conditions. He noted encountering caribou tracks, observing Arctic foxes, and successfully establishing camps, despite temperatures hovering around -30 degrees Celsius. On February 16th, a ranger patrol team conducting a routine flyover spotted what appeared to be Marcus's camp approximately 8 kilometers from his planned position. The sled was visible, along with the collapsed remains of his tent, but no movement could be detected. Weather conditions prevented immediate landing, and the team marked the coordinates for ground investigation once conditions improved. A rescue team reached the site on February 18th, traveling by snowmobile across the frozen landscape. What they discovered defied conventional explanations for wilderness accidents or exposure incidents. Marcus's campsite showed clear signs of recent occupation. A small fire pit contained cold ashes, and his sled had been partially overturned. However, the arrangement of his supplies suggested interference rather than abandonment. Items had been removed from their containers and stacked in unnatural configurations. A cooking pot sat upright on the sled, filled with snow, while food packets were arranged in a rough circle around the fire pit. Marcus's footprints led away from the camp for approximately 15 meters before vanishing completely in the packed snow. There were no signs of wind erasure or fresh snowfall that would explain the abrupt disappearance. The prints simply ended, as if he had dissolved into the frozen air. The rescue team expanded its search radius, but found no continuation of his trail in any direction. What they did find were other prints, deep, human-shaped impressions measuring over 60 centimeters in length, circled the campsite in a wide perimeter. The prints showed 5 distinct toes and demonstrated a stride pattern far exceeding normal human capability. The impressions were pressed deeply into the frozen ground, suggesting immense weight, and they appeared to have been made while Marcus's camp was occupied. The trail of these enormous footprints circled the site multiple times before fading into untouched snowdrifts approximately 50 meters away, disappearing as inexplicably as Marcus's own track. A pungent, acrid odor lingered around the campsite despite the freezing temperatures and constant wind. The rescue team members reported the smell as unlike anything they had encountered. Not quite animal, not quite chemical, but organic and deeply unsettling. The scent was strongest near where the large footprints approached, closest to Marcus's fire pit. Scattered around the site were torn pages from Marcus's journal. The team recovered 14 pages, many damaged by exposure but still partially legible. The later entries revealed growing unease. Marcus had written about feeling observed, about sounds in the night that did not match any wildlife he recognized, and about massive tracks he had discovered while scouting ahead of his camp. His final entry, dated February 15th, described something he had glimpsed at twilight, a dark, upright figure standing motionless on a distant ridge, watching his camp. The writing became increasingly erratic toward the end, and the final sentences were smudged and difficult to decipher. Several pages bore strange marks that the rescue team could not explain. Large, deliberate smudges that appeared to have been made by something other than Marcus's gloved hands. The pattern of tears suggested the pages had been forcibly removed from the journal, rather than torn by wind or accidentally damaged. An extensive search operation continued for 10 days, covering over 100 square kilometers of surrounding tundra. Aircraft equipped with thermal imaging detected no heat signatures. Ground teams found no trace of Marcus Keene. No body, no additional track, no discarded equipment. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist at that campsite, leaving behind only his meticulously arranged supplies and those disturbing journal entries. The official conclusion cited exposure and hypothermia, suggesting Marcus had become disoriented and wandered from camp, possibly falling into a crevasse or being covered by drifting snow. However, the investigators acknowledged significant inconsistencies. The rearrangement of his gear suggested conscious decision-making rather than confused panic. The complete absence of his tracks beyond that 15-meter radius defied explanation, and those enormous footprints, circling his camp like a predator observing prey, remained in the official report as unexplained anomalous impressions. Marcus's family received his recovered belongings months later, including the damaged journal. His sister, reading through the entries, noted that her brother's writing in those final pages reflected genuine fear rather than his usual analytical observations. He had been a rational man, skeptical of wilderness legends and confident in his survival skills. Whatever he had encountered on that frozen tundra had shaken that confidence completely. Local indigenous elders, when asked about the area where Marcus vanished, spoke carefully about places where the boundary between known and unknown grew thin. They mentioned that some sections of tundra demanded respect and distance, that not all who walked those lands did so on two human legs, and that the old stories existed for reasons beyond entertainment. The tundra kept Marcus keen, and whatever had circled his camp that February night left only questions and the unsettling impression of a massive, intelligent presence that understood how to observe, how to interact with human belongings, and how to erase all trace of what it had done. The forested mountains of western Oregon had long attracted families seeking outdoor experiences away from urban centers. The region surrounding the small town of Oak Ridge featured numerous summer camps where children could learn hiking, wilderness survival, and environmental stewardship while exploring dense forests of Douglas fir and hemlock. In late July 2024, the Cascade Youth Camp operated its annual summer session, hosting approximately 40 children aged 8 to 12. The camp, situated in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, had functioned for over 3 decades without serious incident. Counselors followed established protocols, and the program balanced structured activities with supervised free time. Among the campers was 10-year-old Jamie Holbrook, a quiet boy from Portland, attending his first overnight camp experience. On the afternoon of July 28th, Jamie volunteered to help collect firewood for the evening campfire. The task was routine. Children worked in pairs, gathering fallen branches within sight of the main camp area. Jamie's partner, another camper, had returned to camp to use the restroom, leaving Jamie alone for what should have been only a few minutes. When his partner returned to the collection area approximately 10 minutes later, Jamie had vanished. The counselors initiated immediate search procedures. They called Jamie's name, organized the other campers into the main lodge, and began systematic searches of the immediate area. When 30 minutes passed without locating him, they contacted local search and rescue. The Forest Service dispatched a team, and within 2 hours, over a dozen searchers were combing the woods surrounding the camp. As daylight faded toward evening, concern escalated to alarm. The terrain beyond the camp boundaries included several dangerous drop-offs, and night temperatures, while not extreme, could still pose risk to a child alone without proper gear. Search teams used whistles and loudspeakers, hoping Jamie would respond or make his way toward the sounds. At approximately 8:30 that evening, just as search coordinators were organizing night operations, Jamie appeared at the edge of the camp clearing. He emerged from the forest, walking steadily, but appeared exhausted, his clothing torn and muddy, his face scratched by branches. Counselors rushed to him, wrapping him in blankets and checking for injuries. Physically, beyond minor scratches and dehydration, he seemed unharmed. Psychologically, however, he was visibly shaken. Once Jamie had been given water and allowed to rest briefly, he attempted to explain what had happened. He told counselors he had followed what he thought was a marked trail, pursuing a bird he found interesting. Before he realized his mistake, he could no longer hear the camp or determine which direction to return. He had begun to panic when he approached a section of forest with steep terrain and loose rock. Then, according to Jamie, something had appeared. He described a massive figure, much taller than any adult, covered in dark hair and moving upright through the trees. Rather than feeling threatened, Jamie said he felt an inexplicable sense that this figure intended to help him. The creature, for he could find no other word to describe it, had moved deliberately, always staying ahead but within sight, leading him around dangerous areas. Jamie explained that the figure guided him away from a cliff edge he had been unknowingly approaching, steering him instead along a safer route. When branches blocked his path, he found them pushed aside moments after the figure passed through. The creature never approached closely, never attempted to touch him, but maintained a consistent presence that drew him steadily back toward the camp. As they neared the clearing, the figure had simply vanished into the shadows, leaving Jamie able to see the camp lights ahead. The counselors listened with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Children often imagine things when frightened and lost, and Jamie's description seemed consistent with fear-induced hallucination. or the creation of a comforting fantasy to cope with terror. They assured him he was safe now and suggested his mind had created a helpful presence to guide him through a traumatic experience. Jamie insisted his account was accurate, but grew quiet when met with gentle disbelief. The following morning, 2 counselors retraced the route Jamie described, hoping to understand his path through the forest. Approximately 200 meters from where he had been collecting firewood, they discovered his backpack positioned in an unusual spot, hanging from a branch at shoulder height, clearly placed rather than dropped or caught naturally. The area around it showed signs of recent passage through the underbrush. More significantly, the ground near the backpack bore enormous footprints pressed deeply into the soft forest floor. The prints measured over 60 centimeters in length, showed 5 distinct toes, and demonstrated a stride pattern impossible for any human. The counselors followed the trail for nearly 100 meters, noting how it seemed to deliberately avoid the steeper, more dangerous sections of terrain. The prints led in the general direction of the camp before fading near harder ground, where they could no longer be distinguished. The counselors examined what they found carefully, then reported their discovery to the camp director. A decision was made not to alarm the children or parents unnecessarily. Official records stated that Jamie had become temporarily lost, but found his way back safely, with the incident attributed to momentary disorientation quickly resolved. The discovery was noted, but not widely discussed. Jamie's parents arrived the next day to bring him home early. He repeated his story to them, describing the massive figure that had helped him with such specific detail that his mother found herself believing something unusual had occurred. Jamie mentioned the figure's deliberate movements, the way it seemed to understand the dangerous terrain, and its apparent intention to protect rather than harm. In the weeks following the incident, Jamie displayed behavioral changes that concerned his parents. He frequently stared toward wooded areas visible from their home, as if expecting to see something emerge. He woke from nightmares not of being lost or afraid, but of the forest and the presence that had guided him. When asked about these dreams, he struggled to articulate whether he found the memories frightening or comforting. The counselors who discovered the footprint shared their findings cautiously with local Forest Service personnel. The rangers listened with professional interest, but offered no official explanation. One veteran ranger mentioned, off the record, that similar prints had been reported sporadically over the years in this region. Typically, such reports were attributed to misidentified bear tracks or environmental anomalies. However, the patterns Jamie described, the deliberate guidance, the avoidance of danger, the careful maintenance of distance, matched other accounts that occasionally surfaced from these forests. The Cascade Youth Camp continued operations, though counselors enforced even stricter boundaries afterward. Privately, staff members acknowledged an increased wariness about the deeper forest sections, particularly at dawn and dusk when visibility decreased. Some reported feeling watched during perimeter check, though no further incidents occurred. Jamie Holbrook eventually resumed normal childhood activities, but maintained his conviction about what had happened during those hours in the forest. He spoke of it less frequently as time passed, aware that most adults dismissed his account as imagination. Yet the memory remained vivid, that massive, upright presence moving deliberately through the trees, guiding him away from danger and back to safety, never revealing itself fully, but leaving unmistakable signs that something intelligent and capable had intervened in those critical hours when he faced genuine peril alone in the wilderness.